It was an unusually quiet afternoon in the city. The golden hues of the sun cast a warm glow over the streets, and the hustle and bustle of urban life felt oddly distant. Richard, a successful CEO in his mid-40s, was on his way back from a meeting with investors. His mind was preoccupied with the future of his company, its expansion plans, and the constant demands of his high-pressure role. Clad in his usual sharp, tailored suit, he walked briskly down the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, a man on a mission. As Richard approached the corner near the city park, something caught his eye. A small group of children. They were standing near a streetlight, huddled together, looking lost and out of place in the middle of the busy street. Richard slowed his pace, his attention now fully captured by the sight of the four young girls. They looked no older than 9 years old, their faces pale, their clothes worn and ragged. Despite the warmth of the sun, they shivered slightly, their small hands clutching at their jackets for warmth. But what really stopped Richard in his tracks was how strikingly similar they looked to each other. The four girls shared the same blonde, curly hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to shimmer with a mixture of innocence and sadness. The girls had a worn-out quality about them, but there was something familiar in their features, a haunting resemblance to someone he once knew all too well. As he took a step closer, the air seemed to grow still, and for a brief moment, Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Could it be? The resemblance was uncanny. The memory of his ex-wife, Lauren, flashed in his mind. He hadn't thought about her in years, but there was no mistaking it. Their faces, their eyes. These girls looked almost identical to Lauren when she was younger, but it couldn't be possible. Lauren had been out of his life for a decade, ever since he had expelled her from his world. The divorce had been messy, a series of painful decisions that had torn their once loving relationship apart. Richard had made his choice and left her behind, choosing to focus solely on his career. He never looked back. But now, as he stood there, looking at these four young girls, something inside him stirred. The resemblance to Lauren was more than just superficial. It was as if fate had thrown him a cruel reminder of his past, a past he thought he had buried and moved on from. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than mere coincidence. One of the girls, the smallest of the four, took a step forward. She looked up at Richard with wide, hopeful eyes. There was a certain vulnerability in her gaze that made Richard's heart ache. She seemed to be the leader of the group, her small frame carrying the weight of responsibility. She stepped closer to Richard, her tiny feet shuffling nervously against the pavement. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a soft voice that barely reached Richard's ears. "Can you help us? We need help." Richard knelt down, trying to hide his shock. His thoughts raced as he looked at the little girl, then at the other three, who stood silently behind her. They looked just as lost, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. The moment felt like an eternity, as if time itself had stopped. Richard was struggling to find the right words to say. He didn't know whether he should offer them money, call for help, or simply walk away. But something told him that walking away wasn't an option. "Where is your mother?" Richard asked, his voice shaky, though he tried to remain calm. The little girl's eyes dropped to the ground, and for a moment, she didn't answer. The air around them felt heavy, like the weight of unspoken truths hung in the balance. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "We don't have one." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. The words stung, and the world around him seemed to blur. His gaze shifted from the girl to the others, who remained silent, each of them clutching at the others, as if for comfort. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. These girls had no one. They were lost, alone, and in desperate need of help. Richard had built his empire on making calculated decisions, but in this moment, he felt completely out of his depth. His mind raced. What should he do? Who were these girls? Why did they look so much like Lauren? His thoughts spun in circles, but one thing was certain. This encounter was not a random event. Something deep inside told him that these girls held the key to a mystery that he could not ignore. And so, standing there in the middle of the busy city street, Richard made a choice. He couldn't walk away. Not now, not when he felt so strongly that fate had brought him here for a reason. He stood up, looking at the girls with a newfound sense of responsibility. "Come with me," he said, his voice more certain now. "I'll help you." As they slowly followed him, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Richard walked with the girls through the quiet streets, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The city around him seemed distant, as if the hustle and bustle of everyday life no longer mattered. His thoughts were consumed by the mysterious encounter he had just experienced. 4 young girls, no older than 9, had appeared out of nowhere, and they looked almost exactly like his ex-wife, Lauren, from the past. He couldn't deny the undeniable resemblance, and yet the idea of this being a coincidence seemed too far-fetched to believe. After some time, they arrived at his sleek, modern penthouse apartment. Richard ushered the girls inside, his thoughts still tangled in a web of confusion. They looked around the spacious living room, their wide eyes filled with wonder. The plush furniture, the large windows overlooking the city, everything seemed so foreign to them. Yet, they didn't hesitate, quietly sitting down on the couches as if they had been waiting for this moment their whole lives. Richard felt a rush of guilt wash over him. He had built a life of luxury, but the moment the girls walked in, he realized just how empty his existence had become. He was successful, yes, but had it all been worth it if he had to sacrifice the true connections that mattered? The smallest girl, the one who had spoken to him first, sat in the corner, her eyes still downcast. Richard sat down across from them, his brow furrowed with concern. He knew he needed answers, and the only way to get them was to talk to these girls. But where should he start? How did he even begin to ask such a delicate question? He turned to the little girl who had spoken before, trying his best to remain calm despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "You mentioned that you don't have a mother," Richard said softly, his voice laced with curiosity. "Where are your parents? How did you end up on the street?" The girl hesitated for a moment, her small hands gripping the edges of her hoodie tightly. It seemed as though the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. She glanced at the other girls, as if looking for reassurance. Finally, she looked back up at Richard, her big blue eyes filled with a deep sadness. "We don't really know," she whispered. "We were abandoned. We lived with our mom, but one day she was gone. We've been living on the streets ever since. We've tried to find her, but we don't know where she is." Richard's heart clenched at the words. He couldn't imagine what these girls had gone through. Their innocence, their vulnerability, and their need for a family. He could see it all in their faces. Yet what really struck him was the sense of familiarity in their story, the idea of a mother disappearing, leaving her children behind. It tugged at a memory buried deep within his mind. "Do you remember anything about your mother?" Richard asked, his voice trembling slightly. He was starting to piece together the fragments of his past, but he needed to hear more. The little girl nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "She used to talk about someone named Richard. She said he would be able to help us someday, but she never told us who he was." Richard's blood ran cold. His name, the mention of it, after all these years, felt like a punch to the gut. Lauren, his ex-wife, had always dreamed of finding a way to fix their broken relationship, even after everything that had happened. But hearing this now, Richard couldn't ignore the possibility that these girls were somehow connected to her. The other girls remained silent, their eyes downcast. It was clear that they were hesitant to speak, perhaps afraid of what would happen if they shared too much. Richard could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of not knowing who they were or where they came from. But there was something else in their expressions, a glimmer of hope. They were looking to him, waiting for him to step in and make things right. Richard couldn't help but wonder if fate had somehow brought him back into this web of mystery. These girls, abandoned and alone, had somehow found their way to him. And now he had a choice to make. But the questions were only getting bigger. What had really happened to their mother? Was Lauren still out there somewhere? And why did these girls look so much like her? As he sat there, staring at the 4 girls in front of him, Richard couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility rising within him. He had no answers, no clear path to follow. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The truth was out there, and it was waiting for him to uncover it. The mystery had only just begun, and Richard was determined to solve it, no matter where it led him. "Don't worry," Richard said, more to himself than to the girls. "I'll find out what happened. We'll get to the bottom of this." The girls looked at him, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in a long while, they had someone who was willing to help them. And for Richard, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. The days following Richard's decision to take in the 4 girls felt surreal. It was as if his life, which had always been predictable and controlled, had suddenly been thrown into chaos. The presence of these young girls, their innocent eyes, their unspoken fears, seemed to tug at something deep within him, something he had long buried. As the days passed, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival in his life was no accident. Every moment with them only deepened the mystery and the painful connection to his past that he had worked so hard to forget. Richard's thoughts frequently wandered back to Lauren, his ex-wife, and the life they had once shared. His memories of her were bittersweet, full of love and warmth, but also betrayal and regret. He had expelled her from his life a decade ago, convinced that leaving her behind would allow him to focus on his career. He had made it big, built a thriving empire, and lived a life that many envied. But now, standing in his penthouse, looking at the 4 girls who resembled Lauren so closely, Richard wondered if all his success had been worth the price of his broken heart and fractured past. It was the smallest girl who had spoken up first, and she was the one who continued to capture Richard's attention. She reminded him so much of Lauren at that age. Her wide, blue eyes, her soft voice, and the same sense of fear and uncertainty in her gaze. One evening after dinner, Richard found himself alone with her. The others were playing in another room, and the little girl had quietly approached him, clutching a worn-out toy in her hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice hesitant. Richard looked at her, trying to calm the nervous flutter in his chest. "Of course," he replied softly, motioning for her to sit next to him. The girl sat down slowly, her small body curling up into the plush sofa. She stared at the floor for a few moments, her fingers tracing the fabric of the couch. Then, without looking up, she spoke again. "Do you know where our mom is?" she asked. "I remember her saying that we would meet someone named Richard one day. She said that person would help us. Is that you?" Richard's heart skipped a beat at the mention of his name. The words cut through him like a knife, and for a brief moment, he felt completely lost. Was it possible that Lauren had known all along that their paths would cross again? Was this truly the reason why these girls were here, because of some twisted fate that had somehow brought them to him? I don't know where your mom is," Richard said, his voice shaky. "But I promise you, I'll help you. I'll find out what happened." The girl nodded, her small face filled with a quiet sense of understanding. "We've been looking for her for a long time," she whispered. "We don't remember much, but we know she loved us. She always said we'd be safe if we found the right person. Maybe that person is you." Richard was overwhelmed by the weight of her words. He could barely keep his emotions in check. The girl, so young and vulnerable, had placed so much trust in him without even knowing who he was. He knew in that moment that he couldn't let them down. He had to find answers, not just for them, but for himself. This wasn't just about helping 4 lost girls. It was about confronting a past that had haunted him for years and finally making peace with the choices he had made. The next morning, Richard decided it was time to take action. He couldn't ignore the painful truth any longer. He needed to search for Lauren, to find out what had happened to her, and to uncover the truth behind the girl's origins. But as he began to make plans, he realized that he didn't even know where to start. He hadn't kept in touch with anyone from his past, not after he had severed all ties with Lauren. She had disappeared from his life, leaving behind only shattered memories and unanswered questions. Richard spent the next few days digging through old records, trying to track down any information about Lauren's whereabouts. It wasn't easy, but he couldn't stop himself. He had to know. Every phone call, every lead, brought him closer to a revelation that he couldn't ignore. It was as if the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. Late one evening, Richard received a call that would change everything. It was from a private investigator he had hired to trace Lauren's movements over the years. The investigator had finally found something that would lead him to her. The news hit Richard like a wave. Lauren was still alive, but she had been living under a different name, hiding away in a small town several hundred miles away. Richard's emotions were a mixture of relief and fear. He had finally found her, but what would he find when he got there? Was Lauren still the woman he once loved, or had the years of separation changed her into someone he didn't recognize? The next morning, Richard packed his bags and prepared for the long journey ahead. As he looked at the 4 girls playing in the next room, he realized that the answers he sought were within his reach. But he also knew that finding the truth would force him to confront everything he had buried inside for so long. The anger, the regret, the pain of his past. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Richard could no longer hide from his past. It was time to face it. And the truth, no matter how painful, would be the key to unlocking the future, for him, and for the 4 girls who had unknowingly brought him back to life. The drive to the small town was long, and Richard found himself lost in his thoughts, the road stretching out before him like a metaphor for the uncertain future that lay ahead. He had spent the last few days in a whirlwind of emotions, hope, fear, and a deep sense of responsibility. The moment the investigator had called with the news about Lauren, everything had shifted. Richard's life, once so neatly compartmentalized and controlled, had been thrown into disarray. But despite the overwhelming uncertainty, one thing was clear: he could no longer run from his past. He had to face it, no matter the consequences. As he approached the small town, Richard's heart began to race. The streets were quiet, lined with quaint houses and old shops, their windows reflecting the fading light of the late afternoon. This place felt nothing like the life he had built in the city. No tall skyscrapers, no bustling crowds, just the peaceful rhythm of rural life. It felt foreign to him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been here before, at least in some way. He had once shared a life with Lauren, a life that seemed so distant now, but seeing these streets, it all felt strangely familiar. Richard parked his car outside a modest house on the outskirts of town, the address provided by the investigator. The house was small, with a neat garden and a white picket fence. It looked nothing like the luxurious homes he had grown accustomed to, but it was home to someone he once loved, and possibly to someone who held the key to the mystery of the 4 girls. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He had no idea what to expect when he knocked on that door. Would Lauren be the same woman he remembered? Would she be angry, resentful, or perhaps even indifferent after all these years? Or would she welcome him with open arms, as if no time had passed at all? Richard had no answers, but he knew he had to find out. For the sake of the girls, for the sake of his own peace of mind, and perhaps even for the sake of his fractured heart. With a final glance at the girls in the back seat of his car, who had joined him on this journey, he stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. His hand trembled as he knocked softly. Seconds felt like hours as he waited, his mind racing with questions. Would she remember him? Would she recognize the man who had once been so certain of his decisions? The door creaked open, and there she was, Lauren. She looked older, of course, but the woman standing before him was unmistakable. Her hair was darker now, streaked with gray, and her face was lined with the passage of time. But her eyes, those familiar blue eyes, were the same. They met his with a mixture of surprise and hesitation, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. "Richard," Lauren finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, feeling an unexpected lump form in his throat. "Lauren, I didn't expect to find you here." She stepped back, silently inviting him in, and he followed her inside. The house was small but cozy, filled with the scent of homemade food. It felt like a world away from the life Richard had left behind. The walls were adorned with pictures of children, her children. And Richard realized, in that moment, that these were the very girls who had crossed his path just days ago. The connection between the past and present became undeniable. Lauren gestured for him to sit, but neither of them said anything for a long while. The silence stretched out between them, thick with unspoken words. Richard's mind raced. What was he supposed to say? How could he possibly begin to make sense of everything that had happened? Finally, Lauren broke the silence. "You've probably got a lot of questions," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I'm not sure where to start." Richard nodded, his heart heavy. "How are they, the girls? They look so much like you. Why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you leave?" Lauren sighed, her eyes filled with pain. "I never wanted to leave you, Richard, but I had to protect them. I had to protect myself, too. Things got complicated, and I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't stay in a relationship where I wasn't valued, where everything was falling apart. I thought about you every day, but I had to go." Tears welled up in her eyes, and Richard felt a pang of regret. He had once believed that expelling Lauren from his life was the right decision, but now he saw how wrong he had been. The pain in her eyes mirrored the pain he had felt when they had parted ways. It was clear that they had both suffered in silence, each carrying the weight of the past in different ways. "I didn't know where to go after everything ended. I found a new life here, but I never stopped thinking about the girls. They are your daughters, Richard, and I wanted to tell you. I really did, but I was afraid. I was afraid you'd turn your back on them, like you did on me." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. The realization that these girls were his children, his flesh and blood, struck him with a force he couldn't ignore. The past he had tried so hard to bury was staring him right in the face, and in that moment, Richard knew that he had a choice to make. He looked at Lauren, then at the pictures of the girls on the walls. His heart pounded in his chest as he made a decision that would change his life forever. The man who had once abandoned his family now had the chance to rebuild it. He could make things right, for himself, for Lauren, and most importantly, for the 4 girls who had unknowingly brought him back from the brink of emotional emptiness. "I'm not walking away this time, Lauren," Richard said softly, his voice filled with determination. "I'm here to stay. We'll fix this. We'll make it right." And with those words, Richard knew that his life was about to change forever. The decision he had just made was the beginning of something new, a new chapter filled with healing, redemption, and the possibility of a family reunited.